today, I am going to show you how the pros make digital mixes sound more analog and breathe life, energy, and soul into your recordings. Now, to do this, we must reverse engineer the process and characteristics of analog that digital has removed from the mixing process. Now, the first and most important part of this process is understanding that digital has made it so everything can be exceptionally linear, which we think would be a desirable characteristic, but maybe not so much. In the analog domain, non-linearity is the norm. These non-linearities place unique sonic imprints on the sound. For example, in a console, every channel on that console differs a little bit. Or how two 1176 compressors in the analog domain will never sound the same. Similar to how two 1176 plugins don't sound the same. In the case of a console, when each individual track or a group of tracks are summed together into two channels like your mix bus would be, mixers mention they can achieve a different type of width and depth to their mix that's often missed in digital. But also the mechanical nature of analog gear has a personality. Sound is traveling through electrical components. The way these components interact creates subtle dynamic changes in the sound. Let's start with channel differences. So right here, we just have an SSL plugin channel strip. Some of these plugin alliance plugins model this imperfection. So we have this analog setting clicked, and if we boost on the EQ, you see how the left and right channel is different. Now imagine using a console to EQ stereo pairs of strings, stereo pairs of drums, stereo pairs of vocals, etc. And then summing all of those together into two channels with these differences. That has an effect, that has a characteristic about how the sound is being presented. Say we do something like this, say we high pass and low pass a little bit, and we just bump up a little bit on low shelf, we get something right here. These differences throughout a mix can create that depth, that width that mixers speak about attaining in the analog domain. Now, this case right here is an EQ imperfection. In analog, the EQ curves are not as linear and as perfect as the parametric EQs that we use in digital, how these lines are perfectly smooth. And if I boost right here on a parametric EQ, it's only gonna boost right here. But you see how I'm boosting low end, but it's also cutting mid-range. And in this case, this boost in the top end, you see how there's this little hump right here. That's reflective of this piece of gear that they modeled, but that has a sound. You know, this is not a normal EQ curve that you would get with a regular digital EQ. Now, this is a plugin from Corner Audio called the Amplify Instrument Processor, but it shows how sound travels through electrical components. And there's this subtle bit of movement just having it run through it. And you see this liveliness, you see this difference in left and right. You see these movements of EQ right here, because you got to imagine there's electrical current flowing through this machinery. It's alive. So it's not sitting still like how a digital plugin would. So this is one plugin that models this. And then you see if I change the age from new to old, you see how these become a little more exaggerated. And then yet again, these EQ points are giving you some difference left and right, because these channels on all of these consoles, they might be 0.1 or a tenth of a dB off or whatever, but those differences can add up and can give you that extra width and depth in a mix. What I like to do when I'm going for this aesthetic is I'll put these things directly on buses or on stereo tracks. You can also use plugins like RC20 to replicate some of this effect as well. You see how the top end is moving around. If we turn this magnetic up a little bit, we got some moving up and down a little bit, and we got some difference from left and right. But again, there are no rules. You could put things on individual tracks. It just depends on the aesthetic you're going for. But an easy way to kind of get your foot in on doing something like this is putting it on buses. So I'll have maybe some of this kind of flavor on my vocal bus, some of this flavor on my drum bus, my music bus, etc. Right? And then I'll subtly add that back in. So for example, this is a ballad for this specific song, but I'm adding a little bit of wobble and a little bit of the magnetic on this. So this is a 1% wobble, this 1% on the magnetic, and this is where we at. And then on the music bus, I'm adding 1% wobble and 1% magnetic as well, just ever so slightly. Now I'm going to A/B for y'all just with that. So let's listen with it off first.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew. It's like you're walking on water, and all of a sudden you're under. No time to take a deep breath, just pain in your chest while you suffer.
did y'all feel that subtle enhancement of width? That subtle enhancement of depth? Just that little bit of stuff subtly adds so much flavor and character and a little bit of that vibe back to it. I'm using this song specifically because I pretty much use all of these techniques for this vibe. So the next part of this is harmonic distortion or saturation. Now, in almost every step of the way, Analog Gear was adding some distortion and saturation to the signal, kind of coloring and shaping it along the path. We tend to find this a little pleasing to the ear, and it sounds like the audio is getting a little fuller and richer. You also get some EQ from this color. Let's use an example of a typical analog vocal chain, and let me show you how these harmonics and this saturation adds up. So let's say we start with a 1073 preamp. Pretty basic settings. We could at least go up to 5. We already got some harmonics right there. And then let's say we add an 1176. Even more harmonics. That's the recording vocal chain right there. And now we bring it in and we mixing it. So we run it through the console. We run it through the SSL. You see just a little bit added harmonic right here with the SSL. And look at all this fun stuff going on down here. We're going to get to that later. And then let's say we add another vocal compressor and we use the distressor. Even more harmonics. And then let's just say we run the entire mix through some tape at the end. Even more. So all of these harmonics and this saturation and this fun gooiness down at the bottom called noise that we're going to get into later, it adds to the sound. If tastefully done, it can make your audio sound a little richer, a little fuller, or fatter, or sweeter. It just depends on the aesthetic that you're going for and how you're getting from point A to point B. Let's talk about that concept on this vocal. I'm going to mute the 2-track and we're going to bypass all of these plugins. We're starting out with a Pro Q, just doing some high pass 55, and then we're adding an LA2A. Now this LA2A is going to add its own character and its own harmonics and saturation to the vocal as well. So that's our first step right here.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew, it's like you're walking on water, and all of a sudden
it gives me a little bit of EQ on the sound, but it's a little bit of a color. That's my first step into putting in that color for the vocal. And then we're going with the Neve 1073. So we're boosting this up to 15 right here. And then I'll show y'all the EQ curve of this plugin real quick. So this is the EQ curve of what I've done with this plugin. You see, we've just turned down some of this right here and we've got some gain boost. You see some inconsistencies down here, some differing in left and right in the low end. We're leaning into that flavor. So I'll A/B this.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only.
It's already sounding a little more richer, a little more full. And then we come with the pull tech for a little bit more EQ. And this is also going to add some harmonics and saturation to the vocal.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew.
And here we're using this Abbey Road J37 tape for that extra color and saturation as well. But again, for the difference of left and right that you can achieve with this plugin. I'll show you what this one is doing. You see that subtle movement right here, but also the difference of left and right, just very subtly. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy, just very subtly on the mix. And this is giving me some EQ as well. And this is some unorthodox EQ. You wouldn't do this with a Pro Q or anything. That would be kind of unusual to do, but that's the gift of analog. It's giving you some interesting EQ and some interesting color, some interesting personality. It's making you use your ears and really pay attention to if it's helping or hurting the sound. Now let's A/B this on the vocal.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone.
And then we got Magma BB2s just to finish it off, just to give me a little bit more saturation, a little bit more character. This is a very, very light touch too. 3 on the beauty and 1 on the beast. Very light here. Again, I'm doing this very tastefully. I'm very methodical with my approach here because I don't need to go overboard and crank all of these up. I just need that little subtle enhancement and we're good.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew.
There we go. Now we've got our color. We can do this tastefully in the digital realm to replicate that effect, replicate that feeling of what analog is giving us with how it naturally saturates and distorts the audio. But the blessing about digital is we have a little more control over that saturation, because sometimes in analog, all you get was what was right there. But in digital, at least we now have an extra control on how much saturation and distortion we'd like. Next, we got natural compression and musical EQ. Tape compression was a huge thing, but also compression in the form of saturation. In digital, we have the ability to capture the transients extremely accurately. In the several stages of analog, those transients tended to get lost or rounded off. In analog, mixers will have to compress in order to get some of that transient back, but there's something about rounding off the transients that can be a preferred sound, depending on the genre or the vibe that you're going for. Let's take Black Box, for instance, and let's add in some saturation and bring down this output a little bit. You see how it's rounding off at the top? It's giving you some subtle compression on those transients, on those peaks of your audio. I like to use this tastefully on drums oftentimes, because that's one of the most evident places where I heard this occurring in analog. So I'll put this on my drum bus, or I'll put it on individual tracks, whether it's Black Box, whether it's a tape machine, whatever. But this is a plugin I like to use for that. I also like to use this LTL Silver Bullet Mark II plugin on the Hitmaker 4000 setting, because it models an SSL and how you can clip that board. That's what it sounds like it's doing to me. And this is the curve that it's displaying right here on how you can clip or saturate into this plugin and get that natural compression. I'll use this on drums a lot, or on a drum bus a lot. And we could just straight up use the tape simulation, this UAD Studio A800 tape recorder. And you see the curve of the compression of this plugin up here. Again, used tastefully as needed. Now let's talk about musical EQ. One of the great things about digital is we can get extremely precise, but oftentimes we're overdoing it and taking away from the natural character and energy of a sound. In analog, people will focus on broad, big picture musical moves instead of getting lost in the weeds, doing 20 EQ points on a vocal or compressing the vocal 5 times. They didn't even have the ability to take that approach because of the limitations they had, but oftentimes those limitations made for more musical moves. Again, in this case, I took a similar approach with my EQ choices and with my compression choices. Instead of relying on multiple compressors to dial in the emotion of my vocal, I'm using one compressor, I'm using some compression via saturation, and I'm using the fader. I'm automating the vocal because that's what they had to do back then, and that gives me more of a live, more of a performed sound. So these are my broad EQ choices. Oftentimes when I'm EQing this way, I find I don't need to do all of these notches. If I do broad tonal musical EQ, any problem that I was actually hearing is gone. It's normally fixed by just tonally shaping the vocal differently. And if I need to go in and change something, it's usually a couple areas at most. So again, I'm doing a little bit of a boost on the top end, but I'm turning down some 360 and some 350 on this plugin. On the Pultec, we got a little bit of attenuation at 40, but a boost at 40 as well. And then we're boosting some at 10K, very broad, very musical, no attenuation on the top end. And literally, that's it. Then I came in on the entire bus with some detail that I felt I needed. I felt I needed to turn some 360 or some 367 down a little bit. I felt I needed a little bit more boost at 148 and a little cut. I needed to shift that low end energy, it looks like, of her lead vocal. And then here, there was some harshness that I wanted to pull out. These are very broad choices. Technically, I'm not doing a whole bunch of notches. There's one point where I need to pull out a lot of something. Still, these moves right here are very musical. And I'm not doing a whole bunch of small EQ points. I don't need to do that. I kept it very musical and very tonally based. I also forgot to mention that I'm using the warm setting on this EQ, so I'm adding a little bit of saturation here as well. Let's listen to how powerful tonal EQ is. I'm gonna bypass all of the plugins and let's just listen to the tonal EQ change of this vocal.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew, it's like you're walking on water, and all of a sudden you're under. No time to take a deep breath, just pain in your chest.
it's totally been brought to life. That tonal change is just so powerful. I find that I can get 90% of the way on most instruments with overall broad musical EQ. That's all I really need, and any small fine tuning of any overly resonant thing or overly harsh or annoying frequency, then I can come in with my Pro Q or my parametric digital EQ of choice and make those fine detailed adjustments. All right, now next up we have the blurriness or lack of definition of the top end and the low end. A lot of analog equipment and playback equipment didn't have the ability to reproduce the top end in the way that digital can. By effect, this kind of gave music a smoother and warmer tone. Now, this was a limitation of analog, but it did have a sound and a feeling to it, and it made the mid-range more focused, which just so happened to be the area that is pretty important to humans. Now, I'm not saying you need to roll off your top end and your low end, because I love some heavy full low end and some beautiful top end, but it's something to note about how smooth the top end was and how warm and inviting that sound is. So with some of these other plugins, I'm going to show you how I am using them to smooth out the top end. One of my favorite plugins to smooth out some top end is this Sketch Cassette 2. It's just something about the way it rolls off the top end that gives me that smoothness. I'm going to A/B this, but I just wanted to show y'all how I do it. So I use this slider right here. So if I'm going down to Warren, it's low passing it more. If I'm up here, it's giving me a little bit more, but I low pass it to where I feel is good, and then I can come up here to this tape and I can boost it a little bit. So I can bring it back a little bit if I want, or I can keep that down. You see that? So I can bring some of it back with this plugin. It also has some other things on here that we're going to get to talking about later, as you can see, but we're going to get to that. But let's A/B this.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew, it's like you're walking on water, and all of a sudden
Listen to how bright and not brittle, but bright and kind of bitey the vocals are. And then when I bring this in, it just smooths and softens it out in a nice, pleasant way. I'll A/B that one more time.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew, it's like you're walking on water, and all of a sudden you're under.
Beautiful. This worked for the aesthetic, but it is also okay to just high cut the vocal or do a shelf. I do both. It just depends. I oftentimes will do it with a pull tech and I'll attenuate the top end at 20K a little bit. I'll do it like that. Or there are certain plugins that have a roll off on the top, like this knee, for example, has a roll off on the top. So I may use that for it. But also I go through and I automate my S's so they're at a good level going into all of this processing. Now, the next thing is we have a pleasing mid-range. Somehow, all of these records manage to just not have as much harshness as a lot of records do today. I don't know if it's just the nature of running audio through analog equipment or the precision that is available to us through digital recording and how we make music in our DAWs today. Make sure that we pay attention and manage that harshness. That's why in this song, I'm pulling out this frequency right here. Let's listen to this.
I think I second we'd be laughing.
That's a little much. So I'm really getting in there in negative 3.8 dB at 4,260. I'm pulling that out. Just a lot of energy in there that needed to be relaxed. And this was the frequency for me right here. Now you could just EQ it out, turn it down like that. You can, use a dynamic EQ, whatever you need to do, but just managing that harshness, not taking the life away from the vocal, finding that balance to where you still get the energy and the performance of the vocal, but it's not hurting your ears. Now, next, we're going to talk about Wow and Flutter. Now, I'm using this in a few different ways, in 2 different ways in this mix, but I'm using it on the vocal bus and also on the music bus. I'm using the wobble on the RC20, which is a combination of Wow and Flutter, and then I'm using the magnetic, which I'm going to lump into this as well. So let's look and see exactly what these are doing. Let's start with the vocal. Let's turn off the noise. Let's start with the magnetic. So we have Wear and Flutter. Now, all Flutter really is the faster high frequency frequency variations in pitch, and wow is the slower low frequency variations in pitch. Now, technically, these are issues with the analog equipment, but again, they had a sound, and this introduces some imperfection into the audio. So you see how the audio is moving up and down, and there's subtly little slight differences left and right. If I increase this, you'll see more differences left and right, but I had this down at about 1%. We'll go a little higher just for demonstration purposes, but it's giving me that little bit of depth and width by those subtle changes. That's all we're using this for. And then the wear is creating those volume fluctuations, and then we have dropouts here, which is creating those subtle dynamic fluctuations, and then we have flux that even more increases the non-linearity and the unpredictability of technically this defect of analog. When we bring wobble, let's take off magnetic. Now the way I'm using this is a little unorthodox, but we have the wow and Flutter again, and I've got it on stereo. You can adjust the rate at which it's modulating. Again, the flux as in non-linear inconsistencies, and then I have the mix down to 5%. So if I had the mix up, it would just be modulating and moving along this top end area in this way. But for this case, to me, that was too much. So I had to bring that back to about 5% for it to sound natural and pleasing to the ear. But this also is some interesting top end modulation and EQ that gives me a sound. Now on the mix, I'm just subtly using the magnetic and the wobble mix right here is on 100%. Similar things, just giving me a little movement, a little bit of that analog character and life to the music. But also one thing I want to mention about the pitch variation is in digital, we have the ability to play back pitch perfectly, but in analog, that was never the case. If a band was playing, they would normally tune the band to an instrument, a piano or the guitar or something. So things were not 100% in tune like how things are today. And when you would play back music on a record player or a cassette player, there would be these subtle pitch modulations that no one probably ever could really hear, you know, but it's very subtle and it had a sound, it had a characteristic, it had a feeling. And I'm just using these subtle things and I'm adding and I'm salting and peppering throughout the mix to give me a little bit more of that life, to reintroduce those imperfections into the sound, to make it feel a little more organic, make it feel a little more human, especially with the use of virtual instruments today, because these can be so perfect. I'm introducing a little bit of inconsistency into those instruments. We can also have a similar effect just by using the tape plugin as well. They have wow and Flutter, and we can use a tape emulation plugin to add that same effect. Now, last but certainly not least, we got noise. Having a little bit of noise introduced helps create a little more depth and realism to your recording. Think about it, like, when have you ever not heard noise in the background of your life? Especially in times like today where people listen on headphones, it can be helpful to add a little bit of noise in. It's an actual floor that you don't have to hear, but you feel it. It can also add subtle character to specific sounds or to your entire mix. Don't be scared to use noise. In this song, I'm using a little bit of noise and I'm layering it under the vocal. What I like about RC20 is you have different styles of noise too. I'm just gonna A-B the noise real quick.
I think I got addicted to chasing the highs with you. Yeah, 1 second we'd be laughing, the next I'd be crying alone in my room. Oh, if only you knew, it's like you walking on water, and all of a sudden you're...
It's a very subtle thing, which again, this is aesthetic based. It's not like you should do this on every mix, but it goes from sounding like a pop type of ballad to, oh, she's singing on the stage. This feels organic. This feels real. This feels more personal. And both are fine. You feel me? Both are okay. But in this specific situation, adding a little bit of that noise in gave me a floor. And now I could see the stage. I could see where she's at. Again, adding these things in tastefully, little by little. And I know people be hating on H-Delay and their noise, but sometimes I just use H-Delay for their noise and I'll put it on its own separate track and I'll just turn it up and blend it in the mix however I see fit. I literally have my noise preset to where it just brings up this number 2 noise and I'll add that in if I want to. Well, guys, that's the video. Now, there are some other things too that we could have talked about. Like, I was going to talk about crosstalk, but maybe we'll do that in another video. But there are other effects that analog may have on audio. But I think these are some of the most beneficial ones that people can get started with right away. But I cannot end this video without thanking the YouTube members. We are still at a whopping 9. Will we make it to 10 before the end of the year? Find out next week. But I appreciate y'all so much. Y'all are really making this channel grow and get better every week. I'm super grateful for y'all. So here we go. Entre Music, Levon Trilla, Mixed by Jay, Loop Layers, True Art Pro Studio, Dominic Jackson, GoSeti8, Amos Watson, and Jamo Morris. Thank y'all so much for joining the YouTube membership. Starting January, we are reviewing the mixes at least once a month. I'm going to connect the YouTube membership to the Discord, and we'll be able to talk in the Discord. We'll have our own channel in the Discord or whatever, and I'll schedule with y'all when we're gonna go live and we're gonna do music. We're gonna do reviews or feedback and a Q&A, I guess, whatever y'all wanna do. If you're liking the vibe, like and subscribe. I'll see y'all next week.